Hello everyone, and we today are going to be talking about section 1.4 for how does anyone come to understand that it really matters to understand what really matters. And this is the fourth section of chapter 1 of belonging again II.1. And this is also in honor of an upcoming Parallax course that we have starting Sunday. This is the final weekend to sign up, so we'd be thrilled to have you. Please join. If you have any questions about the class, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We'd love to talk about it to any degree you would like. And again, we've already done readings on this interesting question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own, which we have argued is a very interesting question that we've almost seemingly misremembered to believe we've addressed it. And it's a framing for us to take on this question of the address of belonging again. That is very important following the explanation with the loss of givens. We talked about the question of bestocentrism from Nietzsche and how we can read Nietzsche as constantly critiquing this notion of receiving values from something external versus internal. And hello, Mills. It is good to see you. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you're doing well. We then talked about this strange opening episode of The Republic on this idea where Socrates and Glaucon are going down. And it's kind of suggests that philosophy is very weak, because if someone forceful comes along and says, you must go with us, and they're like, well, we don't want to. And the military guy's like, well, you must because I'm stronger than you. And Socrates is like, well, what if we were to persuade you to let us go? And then they go, well, what if we just don't listen? And suddenly there's this weird way in which philosophy is unveiled to be very weak, even though we traditionally can associate philosophy as being very strong. And if that is so, maybe we can be a little more sympathetic and understanding of the Republic, which sometimes can seem totalitarian, because it understands that once people become unpersuadable, there is nothing we can do to make them persuadable again. So that was section 1.3 of belonging again II.1, the address. And again, we will be starting our class on Sunday at Parallax. You can find information to sign up in the description, and we would love to have you. We had so much fun with the Look to the Bird to the Air back in November, and we're very excited to have a chance to do it again. And Andrew Sweeney and Tom do wonderful work at Parallax. And so this reading today is in honor of that. And if anyone has questions in the class, or maybe questions about some of the conversations we had at Parallax, say with Cadell Last or Alex Ebert, please let me know. We would love to talk about it. And again, we're looking forward to the class. So this section of the book, 1.4, how does anyone come to understand that it really matters to understand what really matters, was inspired by a Voicecraft session with Tim Adalin. Voicecraft is magnificent. And this question was asked by Josh Field, which is another way of approaching this question that is necessary for the address on leaving Plato's cave on our own. And we will start now. And as we read, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. So we have inquired into how anyone might leave Plato's cave on their own, and how someone might be a child. We then associated these questions with how might someone be persuadable, which we associated with inability. It takes an ability to be persuadable, which is critical, because once people refuse to be persuaded, there is nothing that can necessarily be done to change them, as Plato might have understood better than us, hence his skepticism of democracy in this odd opening episode of The Republic that Justin Murphy brought to my attention. Here, we will associate these questions with another question that came up in a wonderful Voicecraft session, thanks to Josh Field, where he asked one of the most important questions in the world. Tim Adalin asked a corollary, and I think both questions are strongly tied to the mysterious question, how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own, which leads to intrinsic motivation. The questions, how is it that people come to understand that it's truly important to understand what is truly important? And the second question, how do people come to understand the importance of understanding? Turning to theology, I think this question is similar to the Christian question, how does someone know they need to believe in God? Do people on their own come to understand they need faith, or is it only by God's grace and call for us that we realize our need? Humility seems a good place to start, for if we aren't epistemologically humble, that basically means we think we already know what needs to be known. And if that happens to not be what matters, then it seems practically impossible that we would be shaken awake into realizing the error of our ways. Considering that it is highly unlikely we will naturally know what matters, I think it is very safe to say that the first things we need to answer Mr. Field's question is epistemic humility. Otherwise, it will not be possible for us to move from what we think matters naturally to what actually matters. But that just moves our question to how might everyone be humble? Indeed, we might adjust our question and reframe it a few ways as we advance. To start, I think we can indeed say that we need epistemic humility to address our main inquiry, which is a kind of orientation to the world, a state where we overcome our pride and ego enough to have our minds changed. Without this, we likely won't come to understand what matters unless we just happened to be born understanding this, which is very unlikely, though I cannot say impossible. This requires accepting our imperception, our finitude, our ignorance, and the like, but that just begs a new question. How do people recognize their shortcomings to be epistemically humble? Basically, how do people overcome their egos? The Blank Canvas by O.G. Rose, featured in The Fate of Beauty, explores why intellectual development ultimately requires a dialectic between thought and action. Thus, whatever the answer is to Field's question, the answer cannot be just thought or just acted on. People must undergo a process like Hegel's phenomenological journey or Hume's return to common life, which makes them accept their finitude and integrate with lack, a negation versus an effacement, as described in Negation versus Effacement by O.G. Rose. All right, fine, but assuming people have epistemic humility, surely that is not enough to generate understandings of what matters, is it? Epistemic humility is only a starting point, an opening in which something can enter, but that opening itself cannot be that entering thing. Indeed, epistemic humility is only a precondition for realizing what matters. It is not the whole of it. Just because we are willing to change doesn't mean we will experience that which will make us change. So how do we undergo such an experience? Well, not easily, seeing as it is so hard to determine correspondence while stuck in coherence. To determine what matters suggests that we determine what really corresponds with value versus only seem to correspond with value. Determining correspondence through coherence is difficult, and this is because the map is indestructible, a phrase which refers to the second book in the Map is Indestructible trilogy by O.G. Rose. What I mean by this can be found in the work On Conspiracies and Pandora's Rationality, but basically, we determine rationality and coherence relative to what we believe is true, what corresponds, but that means rationality comes after we determine the truth. This begs the question, how do we rationally assent to a truth? Well, we don't. Truth organizes values, and this means we cannot determine the rational until we decide on a truth that thus cannot be decided on just rationally, as expanded on in a discussion with Samuel Barnes, Mutually Assured Conversation, episode 1. And Mr. Barnes, I would highly suggest his book, The Iconoclast, that gets into this topic as well, and his book, Missing Axioms, which is very good. And I love his conversations with Raymond and Owen over at Schizo FM. So Samuel Barnes is wonderful. To resume, critically, if rationality is in the business of coherence and truth and correspondence, that means correspondence cannot be determined with only rationality. This point can be further argued by incorporating Kurt Gödel, as does the Map is Indestructible. But the point is that we require something transrational or non-rational to determine what corresponds with what matters, and that means another framing. How might we spread the conditions in which the average person is capable to value and discern the non-rational, which is to say, escape autonomous rationality, or AA logic, which is an enclosure. The category of non-rational is critical in game theory, as I discussed with Lorenzo regarding neurodiversity and Nash equilibria, or what I call rational impasses, and the book will elaborate on all this. We all must decide what we will invest in, as Lorenzo and I discussed regarding financial epistemology, and generally I think it's safe to say that we all want to invest in what matters versus what doesn't, but that requires a non-rational choice. But what criteria can make such a choice? It cannot be rational, but that also doesn't mean it is irrational. It must be a choice which transcends the dichotomy and makes the dichotomy possible in the first place. All right, fine. But what would that criteria be? Well, that's a deep question and requires much of the work of O.G. Rose beyond belonging again, but here I'll touch on topics found in The Fate of Beauty, seeing as beauty and lack can be thought together, critical subjects of O.G. Rose. The Blank Canvas would suggest the concept. Thank you, Mills, for the question. I'm curious how the concept of non-decursive reason would fit in. I would say that that's definitely getting at the non-rational, because what happens is if you have discursive reasoning, as I understand it, is going to be stuck in a given linear formulation, Whereas reason, because some people, I guess, would make distinctions between rationality and reason. And whereas when you're kind of stuck in a particular structure of thought, that's where you end up in a Kafka story, like a little fable, as we'll talk about in this book. And that is a major concern of O.G. Rose, which is the notion that once you have a Nash equilibria, the only way to overcome it is something non-rational, not irrational, nor more rational. That's been a terrible mistake, I think. And as a result, we increase rationality, which simply contributes to our enclosure. Now, again, all those terms have to be described, but that's a lovely question. To resume, the blank canvas would suggest the criteria for non-rational discernment must entail action, and I would like to suggest that this action is one which leads to us experiencing something as beautiful. Beauty is an experience which says to us this matters, and the action that leads us to having a beautiful experience can be the choice that results in us undergoing something non-rational, which makes possible rational action. This point is expanded on in What is the Beauty of Life, which hopefully establishes that what we find meaningful is often what we find beautiful, though this, of course, requires us to define beauty, which is attempted in On Beauty. But the point is that an experience of beauty can be a non-rational occurrence, which gives us reason to believe that X corresponds with what matters. No, we can never be certain that X corresponds with what matters, but beauty nevertheless can give us confidence of such, a term elaborated on in Uncertainty by O.G. Rose. All right, but what is it about beauty that suggests this? Beauty suggests an ever mystery, something always beyond subjectivity and irreducible to subjectivity. And this reminds me that Mr. Thomas Jockin is teaching a class on beauty over at the Halcon Guild that everyone should sign up for. Mr. Jockin is absolutely outstanding on this subject, so do sign up for that class and listen to his lectures and conversations that have been posted at the Halcon Guild. To resume, this point recalls Kant's thought on the sublime in his third critique, and for Kant, beauty is an experience that suspends our faculties, and yet the world remains there, suggesting that the world isn't just in our heads, even if we can't move beyond some noumenon. If then we experience our values and actions as beautiful, this would give us reason to think they are not reducible to mere subjectivity, that there is something about them which participates in the world that is there. Maybe not, but beauty can give us grounds. Sure, but how do we experience something as beautiful? That's a great question, and I hope that a metaphysical and ontological outline for this answer can be found in the Philosophy of Glimpses. Assuming it is, though, we still have to ask, how do we experience beauty? This is explored in Reconstructing A as A and gets us into conditionalism, which will ultimately have us consider how we must make a real choice and commit to something, which gets us into the absolute choice. There must be a possibility of failure and death, something we risk being a fool over, and relative to which we seek a new sincerity. Very glad you're in the class as well, Mills. Outstanding. Beauty can occur in the context in which we make a real choice and commit to something, which is to say, meaning and beauty can emerge where we can fail. Meaning risks. As suggested toward the end of Belonging Again, Part 1, for people to understand what really matters in life, they must take a stand for something. There must be the possibility of losing something. After all, if nothing matters, there's nothing to lose, and if there's nothing to lose, nothing matters. In this way, we can understand what matters by understanding what is worth dying for, and that is what we really choose to live for, as perhaps based on what we, non-rationally, find beautiful, the finding of which requires humility. Where there is beauty, we can find motivation to take these risks. Furthermore, to seek beauty aligns with understanding what is truly important, and the experience of beauty gives us both reason to think our understanding is capable of actual understanding, that it can be about something there, and that the thing we understand matters. Beauty can provide two answers, both to the question of how do we know we understand, and the question, how do we understand what matters? And we condition ourselves to experience beauty where we make real choices and/or absolute choices. Choice is central, as Forrest Landry emphasizes. And without it, we will not be able to understand why we need understanding or what matters for us to understand. But choice is hard and existentially difficult. And so another framing, how might more people make real choices? And more pressingly, how might more people make absolute choices? Which is for us as AA in understanding to make ourselves toward AB in reason. Beauty and lack are linked, or can be if we so choose to interpret them as such, an absolute choice, and so the logic we use to discuss beauty could likewise apply to lack. But that gives us another framing. How might more people integrate with lack? How might we spread childhood? So far, to respond to Plato's challenge, we have suggested that we will need to create conditions which incubate childhood and intrinsic motivation. Conditions which help us gain capacity for epistemic humility, non-rational discernment, conditioning, absolute choice. More could be added to this list, such as an A-B onto-epistemology, like what much of O.G. Rose seeks to elucidate. But these are at least what we have covered here, and that I think manifest A-B. Still, we've not answered Plato, only described what people do who understand what's important and who understand that it's important to understand what's important. Plato still has an edge on us, for he might say we must force people to do what we have described. Can we deny him this counter? Not yet. A Nietzschean child is defined in this work as someone who can leave Plato's cave on their own. And it is clear that there have been people like this in history and among us today. These people understand the importance of understanding, are capable of intrinsic motivation, are persuadable, and everything else we have touched on. They are different in this way, AB versus AA, and they think and live differently, as is needed for us to address the concerns of belonging again, part 1. Why do we need people who can think differently? Because that is the only way we might negate sublate the game theory dynamics of game A, described by thinkers of the meta-crisis into a preferable alternative. Those who think differently are those described as absolute knowers, delusions, and children in belonging again, part 1, and it would seem we must become like them. Why exactly can be elucidated by an exploration of neurodiversity, which will lead us into a consideration of Simone Weil, a child saint. But here we might find more strength to Plato and his challenge, for are we not, in trying to spread childhood, trying to spread the conditions which force people to face reality in all its complexity, difficulty, and even madness? Is this really a moral and just thing to do, suggesting why our notion of justice might not be that much better than Plato's? In his excellent discussion on parallax with Andrew Sweeney, A Revelation of Wonderment, Greg Komisacki noted that reality will accommodate our delusions. And if we try to learn the truth, we will find out how deluded we can be and how little we can know, and then we can never go back. Find the sailor, Nabokov. If becoming a child requires this, are we mad? Perhaps, but with the loss of Gibbons and spread of philosophical consciousness following Hume, we've already collectively begun heading in the direction Kamenetsky warns about, and it's impossible to go back. We either figure out how to face reality at scale, or who knows? Perhaps we'll be fine, but if so, I still see no harm in trying to think through the problem of spreading childhood and Plato's challenge, all the same. As Peter Berger taught, we are all philosophical and existential now, but doesn't that mean we've all left Plato's cave? No. For to lose Gibbons is at best for us to be, at best, dragged out of Plato's cave by sociological forces. We are not yet at scale subjects who are able to leave Plato's cave on our own. It seems like we've advanced and seen the truth, and in a way we have, but we are yet at scale to be subjects who can live with this truth. That would require us to become subjects who can leave Plato's cave on our own, and if we've already been dragged out of the cave by the loss of Gibbons in a sense, that might make it all the harder to become children. After all, what's the point? If there is none, that is why the choice can be an abyssal and non-rational absolute choice, which means it can negate sublate AA into AB, thus becoming neurodiverse and capable of avoiding Nash equilibria. Also, perhaps we've only seen shadows on a wall, on a screen, in a mind of us leaving a cave alone. FI, the free interpretation. That will draw chapter 1 to a close on how does anyone leave Plato's cave. We touched on Nietzsche. We touched on the beginning of the Republic. We've touched on this question of how do you get anyone to value things that are important? How do you get them to care about the beautiful, the good, and the true, for example? Through those 4 sections, we've been framing this kind of initial, what the address would have to do. It would have to make people realize what that is important to know what's important, how that it's important to be persuadable, to not rely on bestocentrism, to seek to leave the cave on your own, which is problematic because who thinks they can't leave the cave on their own? So there's an issue of self-delusion there as well. Chapter 2, we'll get into neurodiversity, Simone Weil, and Nash equilibria. And again, this is an honor. This reading is in honor of the class that starts on Sunday over at Parallax. You can find a description in the you can find a link in the description to learn about the class. We would love to have you. We're very excited about it. And for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. Please also, you can find the book on Amazon. All reviews, etc., are greatly appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.